What if the silence of a town was not peace but a mask? Dunmore lay in a forgotten valley, cradled by hills that swallowed sound and gave the illusion of safety. The streets were cobbled, the houses small and pressed close together, the air heavy with wood smoke and the faint toll of the chapel bell. Children played by the riverbanks, their laughter echoing against stone walls, while mothers hung linens in neat white lines that swayed like flags of purity. To anyone who passed through, Dunmore seemed preserved in innocence, untouched by the wider world's cruelty. But beneath the surface, beneath the smiles and bowed heads, the town carried a stillness that was not natural. It was the stillness of breath held too long, of eyes that did not want to see. The chapel stood at the center, its doors always open, its priest always solemn. The townsfolk entered with their confessions, their sorrows, their gratitude, and left with the feeling that God was watching over them. Yet there was another gaze that lingered in Dunmore, one they never named. It was not the gaze of a stranger but of something woven into their daily lives, as ordinary as a neighbor waving good morning. A presence that walked with them, listened when they spoke, studied when they thought they were alone. They did not fear it, for they did not recognize it. Fear needs an object. Here, evil had no face. It lived in the silence, and the silence suited it well. The town's records were neat, its people steady, its order rarely disturbed. A thief had not been seen in years. Doors went unlocked at night. Children ran across fields without worry of wolves or wandering men. Dunmore seemed proof that the world could be kind if people lived simply. But the simplicity was only on the surface. The real order of Dunmore was not the work of chance or virtue. It was the work of a mind that had long decided that peace could be built only through quiet control. That mind hid behind a role that seemed harmless, almost invisible. It kept numbers and ledgers, balanced coins, made certain that debts were recorded and paid. To the town, it was the work of diligence. To the mind behind it, it was the work of destiny. When the wind moved through Dunmore at night, it carried no cries, no sounds of struggle. Not because cruelty was absent, but because cruelty had been perfected. It was a cruelty that left no broken doors, no pools of blood in the streets, no bodies for mothers to weep over. It was a cruelty that erased more than it killed. The town could not fear what it could not see. In this way, Dunmore lived with the illusion of safety, not realizing that safety was the very tool that bound them tighter. In their stillness, in their trust, they made themselves part of the ritual. And the ritual demanded silence. Every town has stories it does not tell, shadows it avoids, but Dunmore had erased the line between truth and forgetting. People disappeared, but not in ways that stirred alarm. They left behind no noise, no rumors of crime, no whispers of scandal. A man gone 1 week was simply said to have traveled, a child missing from the fields was believed to have been taken by illness, a widow who did not open her shutters was assumed to have died quietly in her sleep. Each absence explained itself. The town mourned politely, buried nothing, and continued its routines. But the absences were not natural. They were engineered, shaped with patience, and fitted into a pattern that no one dared notice. The ledger grew, name by name, line by line, while the town accepted its own thinning without protest. What if the things we take as ordinary are not ordinary at all? What if the neighbor who nods kindly is not kindness but calculation? What if the bell that tolls each morning is not faith but a signal, reminding the town of its place in an order they do not understand? Dunmore had made peace with silence, believing silence meant safety. But silence was the mask that allowed the true presence to move freely. It did not hide in shadows or forests. It hid in plain sight, in rituals disguised as daily life, in habits that felt comforting because they never changed. That constancy was not love. It was control. And the control was not of the town's making. It belonged to one mind, methodical, hidden, and already decades into its work. The children by the river laughed, the chapel bell rang, the mothers hung their linens. Life in Dunmore appeared untouched. Yet each sound, each gesture, belonged to a stage set for something else. The presence waited, patient, watching the town forget itself one disappearance at a time. Dunmore did not fear. Dunmore did not question. And so Dunmore allowed itself to be shaped, step by step, ledger by ledger, into something less than alive. What if safety is only another word for surrender? What if silence is only another name for control? The story of Dunmore begins here, not with blood spilled in the streets, but with the silence that swallowed everything. And soon, that silence will show its face. In the town of Dunmore, the bookkeeper was a man few ever thought about for long. He was steady, polite, and careful, the kind of figure who made himself useful without ever demanding attention. His office was a small wooden room near the chapel, stacked with ledgers bound in cracked leather. By day, he recorded numbers with a neat hand, his quill scratching in slow rhythm as if the act itself was prayer. Coins passed through his fingers, debts were balanced, fields measured, and wages recorded. The people trusted him because he was reliable, because he never raised his voice, because his eyes, soft and gray, looked incapable of cruelty. In a town where silence was its own law, he seemed the perfect servant of order. Yet order was not what he served. He served something colder, something older, something that grew fat in the shadows of routine. The bookkeeper's ledgers were not like other ledgers. On the surface, they appeared harmless, each page filled with tidy rows of names, dates, and sums. But tucked between lines of trade and crop yields were marks only he understood. A stroke of ink heavier than the rest, a figure circled twice, a name with a faint cross drawn beside it. These were not accidents. These were selections. Each mark was a choice, each choice a life. The townsfolk thought their debts ended when the coins were repaid, but for some, the true debt was hidden in the bookkeeper's private system, an order of blood masked as bookkeeping. He believed numbers had weight beyond money. To him, numbers were alive. They whispered balance, demanded correction, and punished disorder. His ledgers were holy texts, not of God but of his own creation, and in their columns he read destinies no one else could see. At night, when Dunmore slept, the bookkeeper opened the journals he never allowed others to glimpse. These books were different from the public ledgers. They were written in small, careful script that no one could mistake for ordinary accounting. Here, he described how numbers moved like living creatures, how debts clung to people like shadows, how subtraction could be more than the removal of coin. He wrote that sin was not forgiven by prayer but by erasure, that the true balance of the town depended on those who vanished quietly. In the still candlelight, he created rituals out of mathematics. He described each act of cruelty as though it were a calculation, a neat equation that corrected the world. The blood spilled was not violence to him. It was balance. It was order brought back from chaos. The people of Dunmore adored him in ways they did not even notice. He fixed broken locks, carried heavy loads for widows, mended the chapel clock when its gears froze in winter. He gave small gifts of bread to hungry children, helped the illiterate write letters, and sat patiently with grieving families, assuring them that loss was part of God's plan. They saw kindness. What they did not see was practice. Each act of help rehearsed the control he craved. Each moment of generosity softened their eyes, made their trust deeper, their defenses weaker. He hid behind small acts so that the greater acts, the ones done in secret chambers, could never be imagined. His goodness was camouflage, his quietness the disguise that let him pass unnoticed through the lives he had already decided would end. The bookkeeper was not a man of sudden violence. His cruelty was methodical, never rushed, never sloppy. He prepared his victims as carefully as he prepared his ledgers. Their deaths were not simple killings but rituals dressed as balance. He had methods that erased more than breath. His instruments were chosen not for bloodshed but for silence. He would still the tongue before the heart, cut away memory before he cut away life, so that even the thought of the victim dissolved with the body. He did not see this as cruelty. He saw it as mathematics made flesh, subtraction in its purest form. Each victim was an entry erased, each erasure proof that order was still possible. In the morning, he could walk through the streets with gentle eyes, and no one would ever guess that the hands which lifted a child's toy from the mud had hours before stripped the voice from a living soul. The chapel bell marked the hours of his days, but it was his ledgers that marked the hours of his nights. In his journals he wrote of numbers that breathed, of debts that moved like smoke through families, of stains that only subtraction could cleanse. He believed himself chosen, not by the priest or by the town, but by something higher that hid its face. That belief made his cruelty clean in his own eyes. He did not see blood when he worked. He saw the ink of disorder wiped away. He saw columns balanced. He saw Dunmore made pure through the suffering no one else dared to name. And when he closed his books before dawn, extinguished the candle, and stepped into the cool air of morning, he wore the mask of silence once more. The townsfolk would greet him, nod politely, and hand him their coins. None of them would know that in his hidden ledgers their names had already been chosen, their debts already called. And so the keeper of ledgers walked in daylight with gentle eyes, and at night with hands that erased. To the town he was a servant of order. To himself, he was its master. And the silence of Dunmore deepened, because silence was the soil in which his order thrived. Soon, the garden beneath the chapel would show what balance truly meant. Beneath the chapel, where the townsfolk came to kneel in prayer, another chamber waited in silence. Few knew of its existence, and none who entered it ever returned to tell. It was not marked by stained glass or the scent of incense, but by damp stone walls that pressed inward like a tomb. The air was colder here, thick with rot and something metallic that clung to the tongue. The bookkeeper had claimed this space years before, carving it into order with the same patience he gave his ledgers. He called it his garden, though no sunlight touched it. To him, it was a place of cultivation, where disorder was cut away and balance took root. Here, devotion did not lift hearts toward heaven. Here, devotion demanded erasure. The chamber was arranged with perfect symmetry. Objects lay in careful positions as though each were a sacred tool. There were no crosses, no icons, only instruments designed to quiet the living before extinguishing them. Every surface carried the mark of planning. Chains hung from hooks not in chaos but in measured intervals, like the notes of a hymn frozen in metal. Stones on the floor were scrubbed clean in square patterns, the dirt beneath them packed hard as though something had been planted and uprooted countless times. The garden beneath the chapel was not for flowers or grain. It was for bodies. The soil drank what the town refused to see. It soaked in the weight of those chosen for subtraction, and in its silence it grew rich with what he believed was necessary sacrifice. The victims who entered this chamber did not scream, at least not for long. Screaming was disorder, and he did not allow it. He silenced them first with precision, sometimes removing the very ability to cry out before the act of killing began. He called it pruning. To him, sound was an excess, a wild growth that needed to be trimmed if balance was to be restored. Tongues were severed, throats crushed with tools that left no marks visible above the skin. What remained was silence carved directly into flesh. This silence was not mercy. It was part of the ritual, a step required to make the subtraction pure. Only in quiet could the final act be counted properly, as if the absence of noise confirmed the correctness of the sum. In this hidden garden, cruelty was never rushed. He treated each life as a problem to be solved, each body as a sum waiting for completion. He would lay them in symmetrical positions, arms folded across their chests or spread like scales, and then he would begin his work with the calm of a priest at altar. But his sacraments were not blessings. They were mutilations that stripped identity piece by piece, until the person was no longer a person, only a remainder, an unfinished number that he alone had the power to resolve. He might cut away a hand so the victim could not grasp, a face so they could not be recognized, or even memories by suffocating them into half-conscious states where time itself became fractured. His garden was not a place of growth but of dismantling, where humanity was pared back to nothing. The soil beneath the chapel was dark not from water but from years of this work. He buried the remains shallow, not because he feared discovery, but because he believed the earth needed to keep tasting the blood, again and again, to maintain its balance. Each body was placed in a pattern, never random, their positions forming shapes that only he understood. He thought of these shapes as roots spreading through the ground, connecting the dead to one another, binding their subtraction into one great order. When he walked across the floor of the chamber, he could feel the ground shift beneath him, soft in places where too much had been fed into it. Yet he smiled at this, for to him it meant the soil was alive with the weight of his devotion. The townsfolk prayed above, whispering their sins and hoping for forgiveness, unaware that beneath their knees another ritual consumed the very fabric of their safety. Their prayers never reached the chamber. The stone between them and it acted like a veil, keeping their faith clean while their world was rotting beneath. This was how he wanted it. The separation was necessary, for the garden could only thrive if the people remained blind. He knew if they suspected, they would call him monster, but he also knew they would not look too closely. Silence protected him. Silence had always been the true wall between his work and their lives. And so he let the bell ring above while he kept count below, both halves of the chapel serving the same God of order, though only one congregation knew the name. In the still hours before dawn, when the bodies were buried and the stones cleaned, he would step back and study the chamber like a farmer studying rows of planted seed. He saw balance in the lines, beauty in the precision, comfort in the order he had carved into chaos. To him, this was devotion. To him, this was creation. He believed that each victim was not destroyed but transformed, turned into part of something larger, something eternal that only he could see. And with this belief, he carried no guilt. He walked back into the daylight with gentle eyes and steady hands, while beneath his feet the garden waited, ready to drink again. Above the ground, Dunmore remained still, trusting, and unaware. But below, the soil kept its secrets, and the garden grew. Soon, the kindness they loved in their bookkeeper would show itself as something else, something none of them were prepared to face. The bookkeeper's life was lived in 2 layers, and the one the town adored was the gentler mask. In daylight, he was a man of quiet service. He visited widows with baskets of bread, never forgetting their names or the birthdays of their children. He sat on benches with the elderly, listening patiently to stories that rambled and repeated themselves. He offered lessons to children who struggled with numbers, his soft voice guiding their clumsy hands across slates until they smiled with pride. He was present at every gathering, polite in every word, steady in every gesture. Dunmore trusted him as one trusts a lamp in the dark, not because it shined brightly, but because it was always there, dependable, familiar, and safe. What no one understood was that each of these moments was not kindness but rehearsal. He was not giving, he was studying. He was shaping the town's image of him as carefully as he shaped his ledgers, ensuring that when suspicion might arise, it would collapse against the wall of his apparent innocence. Each smile he gave was measured. Each gentle touch was calculated. When he lifted a child into his arms, it was not affection that guided his strength but practice, testing the weight, gauging how easily the small body could be carried without resistance. When he helped an old man walk across the square, it was not compassion but rehearsal for the rhythm of dragging, a test of how long flesh could lean against him before fatigue betrayed him. Even in the simple act of mending a clock, he was not serving the town but training himself. Every cog, every spring was a reminder of order, of how small parts moved together until time itself was under control. The people believed they were watching goodness at work. In truth, they were watching cruelty polish its tools. There was no malice in his mask, no false warmth that might betray him. He did not force himself to act kind. He became kindness so completely that others never thought to doubt it. That was his greatest talent, to wear innocence not as a costume but as a second skin. He absorbed the town's trust the way soil absorbs rain, silently and without waste. He learned their fears, their hopes, their weaknesses, and filed them away like sums in his hidden journals. Every confession whispered to him in gratitude was another debt recorded. Every child who laughed in his presence was another entry marked for later. He lived among them as part of their daily rhythm, all the while weaving his own pattern beneath the surface, a pattern of selection that no one else could see. His acts of charity were rehearsals for control, but they were also rituals in their own right. He believed that to balance the ledger of life, he must first soften the heart of his subject. Innocence was not only his mask but his bait. He needed his victims to walk willingly into trust, to see him as safety before they vanished into silence. He believed this softened trust carried a kind of weight, that when taken away it deepened the subtraction. To erase someone who had never feared him was to erase them completely, leaving no trace of resistance, no scar of suspicion. They disappeared as easily as numbers wiped from a slate, and the town mourned them only in whispers before forgetting them altogether. In this way, he perfected not only cruelty but erasure, and it was the mask of innocence that made both possible. Children loved him most, and this was where his disguise grew strongest. He taught them riddles and sums, showed them how to repair small toys, even performed simple tricks with coins to make them laugh. To the parents, he was a blessing. To himself, the children were practice in shaping perception, teaching him how to lower fear until even the most vulnerable gave themselves over. He would kneel so his eyes were level with theirs, showing a humility that looked pure but was in fact predatory. He learned to soften his breathing, to let his gaze linger just long enough to seem warm, never long enough to reveal calculation. This patience gave him power, and power gave him control. In those moments, the town saw a gentle guardian of their future. He saw the outlines of subtraction waiting in small, fragile forms. His work with the poor and the grieving was another layer of this disguise. When he brought food to a widow's door, he watched how she accepted it, how her trembling hands reached for the gift, how her eyes filled with relief. He learned how gratitude softened memory, how kindness clouded suspicion. The more he gave, the less they would ever doubt him. To them, he was the quiet heart of Dunmore, a man who asked for nothing in return yet gave everything. They did not know that each gift was also a seed planted, preparing the soil of trust so that when the moment of erasure came, the ground would offer no resistance. In their eyes, he was a pillar of mercy. In his eyes, they were already marked as entries in his private book of balance. The bookkeeper's genius was not only in the acts themselves but in how he wove them seamlessly into the rhythm of the town. He never overplayed his kindness. He never sought praise. He let others speak for him, let their admiration grow naturally, until it became impossible for anyone to imagine him as anything other than good. In this way, his innocence became self-sustaining. It was no longer a mask he wore but a reputation carried by the people themselves. They defended him without knowing why, trusted him without needing reason, loved him without seeing the cold mathematics behind his eyes. His mask had become their belief, and their belief was the strongest shield he could ever possess. Above the chapel, the bell rang as always, marking time for a town that thought itself safe. Below, the garden of silence waited, tended by hands that had just carried gifts to the hungry. This was how he thrived, by feeding one world while feeding upon another, each act of kindness balancing each act of cruelty, each smile preparing the face that would later bend close in darkness. The bookkeeper's innocence was not weakness. It was the veil that allowed his order to endure. And soon, Dunmore would learn that what looked like kindness could be the sharpest cruelty of all. The bookkeeper never chose at random. To him, chance was chaos, and chaos was the greatest sin. Each victim belonged first to his ledgers, their names written neatly in ink that looked harmless to any other eye. But beside those names were marks and symbols, his secret language of selection. A family that had grown too numerous, a man whose laughter disturbed the silence, a child who asked too many questions, all of these were debts to be corrected. He saw the town not as a living community but as a vast equation. Every life was a number, every number had weight, and when the sum grew uneven, subtraction was required. He did not kill because of anger or hunger or desire. He killed because the balance demanded it. Each death was an act of solving. His methods were shaped by this belief. No two erasures were alike, because no two debts carried the same flaw. If a widow's grief had turned into endless wailing, he would remove her voice first, believing the subtraction of sound itself was the correction. If a family's bond was too strong, he would dismantle it piece by piece, erasing the child who held them together, leaving the survivors hollow and drifting. If a man was proud, he would take from him the strength of his body, ensuring that when the subtraction came it was not just of breath but of dignity, reduced to weakness before being erased. In this way, cruelty was never blunt force. It was tailored, designed as though each act were a dark form of craftsmanship. He believed every subtraction solved a problem, and the more elegant the solution, the more pure the balance became. The rituals themselves were quiet, precise, and stripped of drama. He worked as he always did, methodically, as if recording figures in his books. He prepared the chamber with objects laid out in order, the instruments chosen to match the nature of the debt. Each cut, each silencing, each disfigurement had meaning. He was not careless. He never allowed blood to flow and waste, never left screams unmeasured. The suffering was not for cruelty's sake but for completion. He believed suffering was the residue of imbalance leaving the body, and that the final silence confirmed the debt had been cleared. To him, the dead were not victims. They were entries resolved, their weight removed from the town so the sum could stand whole again. And so he erased them without hesitation, because hesitation was disorder. The townsfolk did not see what he was doing to them. They noticed only that over the years Dunmore seemed smaller, its gatherings quieter, its laughter more restrained. They explained this away as the natural passing of time, the weariness of age, the hardships of rural life. They told themselves that families drifted, that illness claimed the young, that accidents struck without reason. What they did not see was the hand guiding these absences, pruning them with care so the town would never collapse all at once but instead thin gradually, like a tree losing leaves one by one. He wanted them weaker but unaware, for strength without suspicion allowed him to continue his work unseen. To him, Dunmore's silence was proof of success. They mourned without understanding, and their acceptance was the truest sign that his equations were correct. In his private journals, he wrote of these acts as if they were sacred ceremonies. He described each victim not by name but by flaw, reducing them to the disorder he believed they carried. A loud woman became the voice, a proud man became the tower, a curious child became the question. He never wrote of what he took from them in flesh, but he recorded what he took in balance. Each subtraction had purpose. Each purpose was explained in a language of numbers, circles, and strange marks that no one else could read. He filled pages with these records, and when he closed the book he felt a calmness that the chapel above could never give him. Prayer was hollow, but subtraction was final. Only subtraction could create order. To those who trusted him, he was still the gentle bookkeeper, the man who carried bread to the hungry and mended clocks for the chapel. They never saw the cold symmetry of his cruelty. They never saw the way he matched method to victim, the way he tailored each erasure like a craftsman cutting stone. They never guessed that their safety, their calm routines, their quiet mornings, were being built on the steady removal of those who had been judged unfit to remain in the equation. His mask of innocence gave them comfort, and their comfort gave him cover. It was a cycle as perfect as any sum he had ever written. Above ground, Dunmore continued to trust, never realizing that its own weakening was the very proof of his devotion. Below ground, the ritual of subtraction continued, each act another mark against the town's soul. He believed himself a servant of order, but in truth, he was its destroyer, one careful cut at a time. And soon, the sickness of silence he had sown would spread further, until the town could no longer tell whether it was alive at all. Grief in Dunmore took on a strange shape. It was not loud. It was not filled with wails or torn garments or processions of mourning. Instead, it was muted, a hollow ache that seemed to swallow itself before it reached the surface. Families mourned without knowing what they mourned. A child would not return from the fields, a husband would not wake from his bed, a sister would vanish on her way to fetch water, yet no body ever lay to be buried. There were no coffins lowered into the ground, no graves to visit. The absences were clean, surgical, as if the people had been subtracted not only from life but from memory itself. Mothers wept, but their tears were shallow, their pain muted by the strange emptiness of not having proof. Dunmore learned to carry grief like an invisible bruise, tender but unseen. The sickness spread through the town without contagion. It was not in the air, nor in the water, but in the silence that followed each disappearance. People began to speak less of those they had lost. To mention them felt strange, almost dangerous, as though the names themselves might vanish too if spoken aloud. The townsfolk carried their sorrow quietly, each family isolated in its own private confusion. They could not come together to share grief, because grief without bodies felt shameful, as if it were weakness rather than tragedy. And so the sadness remained locked inside homes, festering like rot sealed in wood. The bookkeeper thrived in this silence. Each absence he created deepened the sickness, and each family that chose silence over suspicion gave him proof that his rituals worked. The bookkeeper studied their grief with the same calm he gave his ledgers. He saw how the families walked slower after their losses, how their voices softened, how their shoulders stooped under invisible weight. He noted that meals became smaller, laughter rarer, gatherings shorter. He believed this weakening was not cruelty but progress. To him, their fading was purification. He thought of it as a second subtraction, first the life taken in the chamber, then the hollow that spread into the survivors, draining them of will. He called it the quiet sickness, and he believed it was as important as the killings themselves. For what good was subtraction if the town remained strong? Only when Dunmore bent beneath the weight of its own silence would the equation be complete. It was not death that haunted the town but uncertainty. With no body to bury, grief could not end. A mother could not mark the grave of her child with flowers, so she kept the flowers inside her home until they withered in the vase. A widow could not sit by her husband's stone and speak her sorrow, so she swallowed it until it grew heavy inside her chest. The absence of ritual left the people stranded in endless mourning, unable to release the dead because they did not know how. This was the sickness the bookkeeper had designed, pain that had no outlet, sorrow that produced no protest, despair that chained itself in silence. It was a prison built not of walls but of unspoken weight. What made this cruelty most effective was how natural it appeared. People did not think of murder or ritual. They thought of fate, of illness, of misfortune. They told themselves life was fragile, that the world was cruel in ways no one could prevent. They believed silence was wisdom, that speaking too much of loss might anger God, that questions might invite more sorrow. In this way, the bookkeeper's work spread like a fog, unseen, unexplained, yet always present. He never needed to silence the town with threats. They silenced themselves, each choosing quiet as a shield, not realizing it was the very thing that allowed him to continue. The sickness was not in their blood. It was in their trust. The bookkeeper walked among them each day, offering small comforts, watching the sickness deepen. He would place a hand on a shoulder, offer a few soft words, and they would thank him with grateful eyes. To them, he was a balm. To him, he was feeding the illness. His kindness reassured them that no hand of malice had touched their lives, that the order of the world was intact. This reassurance was the infection. It blinded them to the truth, kept them docile, weakened them further. And as they grew weaker, he felt stronger. Their sorrow was his harvest, their silence his shield, their confusion his perfection. Soon, Dunmore was no longer a town of laughter but of whispers. The bell still rang, the children still played, but everything felt thinner, more fragile, as if the town itself was drifting into a shadow. They did not realize they were already trapped in the bookkeeper's design, their lives measured, their sorrows calculated, their voices stolen without touch. It was the sickness without contagion, the plague of silence. And in that silence, he found the purest proof that his ritual was working. The town bent lower, and the bookkeeper's eyes watched with calm satisfaction. What they saw as grief, he saw as progress. What they carried as sorrow, he recorded as balance. And soon, one child would notice what no one else dared to see, that the sickness was not fate but design. Among the quiet streets of Dunmore, where the sickness of silence had spread into every home, one child began to see what others could not. She was small, no older than 10, with sharp eyes that lingered where others turned away. While the townsfolk accepted each disappearance as fate, she kept count. She counted the children who no longer played by the river. She counted the empty chairs in the chapel. She counted the missing faces in gatherings that grew smaller each season. Her mind did not settle with excuses. Where others saw chance, she saw a pattern. Where others bowed their heads to mystery, she began to suspect design. She counted differently, and that difference set her apart. The child's family had been touched by the sickness too. A brother vanished on his way to gather wood, leaving behind no body, no trace, only silence. Her mother wept quietly, her father prayed longer at the chapel, and then life continued as though nothing more could be said. But the child could not let it go. She remembered the precise way the bookkeeper had visited their home that week, offering bread to soothe their grief. She remembered how he had lingered at their table, asking questions not of comfort but of detail: how many brothers she had, how many mouths were fed, how many coins remained. Others saw a kind man helping the poor. She saw the way his eyes did not soften when he asked. They calculated. They weighed. They measured. It was then she began to watch him more closely. The bookkeeper's habits, invisible to the town, became vivid to her. She noticed how he walked the same paths at the same hours, how his visits always fell into rhythm, how his small acts of kindness repeated like rehearsed steps. He helped a widow carry water one day, and 2 weeks later she was gone. He taught a child his sums, and days later the child's chair at school sat empty. To others, these were tragedies scattered by fate. To her, they were rehearsals before erasure. She saw the ledger in his hands, the way he traced lines on the page even when no one watched, his quill moving like a knife slicing numbers into silence. She began to see him not as a helper but as an accountant of death. Her counting grew into obsession. She scratched marks into wood, into stone, even into the dirt with her fingernails, trying to keep track of the absences the town refused to name. She whispered the names of the gone at night so they would not vanish completely, even as her parents told her to stop, to accept, to forget. But forgetting was the very sickness she feared. She saw what the others could not, that silence was not healing but control. That each vanished soul left behind not just grief but weakness, and that weakness was spreading through Dunmore like roots under the earth. She felt it in the heavy air, in the way people avoided each other's eyes, in the chapel prayers that grew shorter, emptier, more desperate. It was as if the town itself was being subtracted, and only she was counting the numbers left behind. The child's fear sharpened into clarity one afternoon when she saw the bookkeeper in the square. He was bent low, showing a trick with coins to a group of laughing children. His face wore kindness, his eyes gentle, his hands careful as he made the coin vanish in return. The others laughed, but she watched the way his eyes flickered not with joy but with calculation. To them, it was play. To her, it was rehearsal. He was practicing disappearance, not of coins but of lives. The laughter of the children did not comfort her. It chilled her, for she knew some of them would not laugh again. She saw subtraction written across their small, trusting faces. The bookkeeper did not notice her watching, not at first. But she was always there, in the edges of crowds, behind doorways, at chapel corners, her eyes fixed on him when others looked away. She studied him the way he studied the town. And in her gaze, the silence of Dunmore began to crack. For the first time, someone counted differently. For the first time, someone refused to be blinded by kindness. She did not yet know what she would do with what she saw, only that she could not unsee it. The pattern was too clear, the numbers too precise, the absences too perfect. She knew now that Dunmore's suffering was not fate. It was design. It was ledger. It was subtraction. And so the child kept her count, whispering the names of the gone like prayers, scratching her marks where no one else could see. She became the single thread pulling at the fabric the bookkeeper had woven so carefully. The town still slept in silence, but one pair of eyes had opened. And once open, they would never close again. The child's suspicion carried her farther than curiosity ever should have gone. Nights in Dunmore were heavy with silence, but her small feet learned to move through them unseen. She followed the bookkeeper's shadow more than once, watched him vanish through the chapel doors long after the bell had tolled its final hour. She wondered what prayers required such secrecy, what kind of devotion needed the cover of darkness. One night, with the fear of her own heartbeat pressing against her ribs, she slipped inside after him. The chapel above was empty, rows of benches staring forward as if they had witnessed too much already. But in the corner, near the altar, she found a narrow door that led down into the earth. The air grew colder as she descended, the scent shifting from candle wax to stone, from stone to something damp and spoiled. When she reached the bottom, she stood before the garden beneath the chapel, and what she saw was not worship but design. The chamber was not soaked in blood, not in the way she had imagined monsters. It was worse. It was clean, organized, arranged with such care that it felt like stepping into the mind of someone who believed cruelty was not chaos but art. Instruments were laid out on a long table, but they were not the blades or clubs of ordinary violence. They were stranger, more deliberate, tools shaped not just to harm but to erase. There were clamps that crushed without tearing, masks lined with cloth that muted breath, devices that bound the mouth in silence while leaving the eyes open. The child did not understand them fully, but she felt their meaning. These were not tools to kill the body alone. They were tools to kill memory itself, to strip away voice, face, recognition, until nothing remained but an empty subtraction. The floor carried patterns, etched into stone as though someone had carved equations into the earth. Circles within circles, lines that crossed like scales, each mark stained darker where the soil had drunk deeply. She realized then that the bodies buried here were not buried at random. They were arranged, placed like numbers in a sum too large for her to comprehend. The chamber was not just a place of death. It was a ledger written in flesh, each victim a symbol, each absence a line in the bookkeeper's great design. She felt it then, not just the horror of the room, but the weight of meaning pressed into every corner. This was not cruelty for its own sake. This was ritual, and ritual did not stop until it was finished. She saw no corpses, but she did not need to. The chamber breathed absence. It was in the cold that clung to her skin, in the silence that seemed thicker here than anywhere above. It was as if the voices of the taken had been pressed into the walls, not as echoes but as erasures. The horror was not what was done but what it meant. This was a place that consumed history itself. Each victim had been more than erased, they had been rewritten, turned into part of a pattern only the bookkeeper understood. The town would not only forget their names. It would forget that they had ever been. That was his true power. Not subtraction of life, but subtraction of memory. The child trembled, but her eyes did not close. She walked the perimeter, her small fingers brushing the cold stone as if touching it could prove it was real. She found scraps of fabric, a shoe too small for any grown man, a lock of hair pinned beneath a stone. Not trophies, never displayed, but remnants left behind in the machinery of erasure. She felt as though she was looking at shadows of people who had once been whole, now reduced to parts with no meaning. She realized the cruelty was not in pain alone but in purpose. To suffer and die was terrible. But to suffer and then vanish as though one had never lived, that was the perfection of horror. In that moment, she understood what none of the townsfolk had dared to see. The sickness that spread through Dunmore was not just grief without bodies. It was history itself being eaten away, one person at a time. Each absence was not just a subtraction from life but a subtraction from memory, from story, from the town's own soul. The bookkeeper was not killing alone. He was unmaking. He was turning Dunmore into a place where fewer and fewer names would remain, where silence would not only hide the dead but replace them. It was a ritual of control so complete that even time bent to it, erasing the past to make the present weaker. The child's heart pounded as she looked upon the chamber, but she knew she could not turn away. She had counted the missing above, and now she had found where their numbers had gone below. Yet she also sensed something else. The patterns carved into the stone were not perfect. A line had been scratched over, a circle broken. It was small, easy to miss, but to her young eyes it looked like a mistake. And in that mistake, she felt a shift, an opening, a possibility. Even perfection could falter. Even the most careful ledger could contain miscalculation. She did not yet know what it meant, but she clung to it as the only hope in the suffocating dark. When she climbed the steps back into the chapel, her body shaking with cold and fear, she carried with her more than terror. She carried knowledge. She carried proof that the silence of Dunmore was not an accident but a design. And she carried the thought that perhaps design could be broken, if someone dared to see the flaw. Perfection had always been the bookkeeper's armor. Each line of ink, each silent erasure, each ritual beneath the chapel was shaped with such precision that no mark of his true work reached the surface of Dunmore. His order was flawless, or so he believed. But perfection is fragile, and when it breaks, the crack spreads faster than the mind that once controlled it. His mistake began as something small, something so ordinary that only eyes trained by obsession could have seen it. One evening, when the candle in his study burned low and the night pressed heavy against the shutters, he closed his ledger without finishing the final entry. A name was written there, a mark beside it, but no line of subtraction followed. The page remained open when he left the desk, the ink still wet, the order incomplete. For the first time in years, the bookkeeper left a thread loose. The child found it. She had taken to slipping into his office when she knew he was away, her curiosity emboldened by the chamber she had discovered beneath the chapel. She expected to find nothing but harmless sums, the false accounts he showed the town. But on that night, she found the ledger left open, the unfinished entry staring back at her like a wound in the paper. She traced the letters with her small hand and felt a chill stronger than the cold stone beneath the chapel. The page did not describe trade or crops. It described subtraction. It named a person she knew, someone still alive, someone who smiled in the market only that morning. To see their name written as already gone was to see the future written before it had arrived. She understood in that instant that the ledger was not record but prophecy, and that the bookkeeper was not a servant of order but its executioner. When he discovered the ledger was missing, something inside him faltered. He searched his desk, the chapel, the chamber beneath, each movement sharper than the last. His mask of calm began to slip. For years he had hidden behind routine, his cruelty shielded by innocence. But now the order frayed. His hands shook when he greeted the townsfolk. His eyes darted too quickly when they spoke to him. He returned again and again to his office, pacing like a caged animal, desperate to find the book that had always been his anchor. Without the ledger, he was not himself. He was chaos. He was fear. He was exposed. And the town, though still blind, began to sense something strange in the man they had trusted for so long. The child held the ledger close, her small fingers smudging the ink as she turned its pages in secret. What she saw inside was worse than anything she had imagined. Each disappearance recorded not as crime but as correction. Each family marked not by love but by flaw. She read of the voice silenced, the tower reduced, the question erased. She saw her brother's absence not described as loss but as balance restored. The cruelty was not in the pain itself but in the cold mathematics that justified it. Every line was written without remorse, without doubt, as if subtraction were not sin but duty. She realized then that the sickness spreading through Dunmore was not accident. It was ledger. It was ritual. It was the will of one man disguised as the will of order. The knowledge weighed heavier than her small body could carry, but she carried it still, because to keep it hidden was to become part of the silence that had already consumed so much. The bookkeeper grew erratic in the days that followed. His careful kindness turned brittle, his rehearsed generosity sharp at the edges. He snapped at children when they crowded too close, glared at widows who thanked him for his help, and moved through the square like a man who no longer trusted the eyes upon him. The town noticed. They whispered. They wondered if grief had touched him too, if illness had changed his temper. But beneath their soft questions a harder truth began to stir. They began to look at him not only as a servant of charity but as a man who might be hiding something behind it. The silence that had protected him for years began, at last, to fracture. It was the ledger that did it. The child placed it where others would find it, not boldly but carefully, slipped into hands that could not ignore what they read. At first, there was disbelief. The neat lines, the calm handwriting, the marks beside familiar names, it seemed impossible that such cruelty could come from the man who had taught their children sums, who had carried bread to their doors. But as more pages were turned, as more names were matched to the absences they had endured, disbelief gave way to horror. The town's trust, once unshakable, began to crumble. The mask of innocence was still on his face, but now they could see the cracks beneath it. They saw not charity but calculation. They saw not kindness but rehearsal. They saw not fate but subtraction. And so Dunmore changed. The sickness of silence did not vanish, but it began to shift into something else. Fear, suspicion, anger, all rose where silence had been. For the first time, the town looked not at their own sorrow but at the man who had fed upon it. The bookkeeper felt their eyes on him, heavier than any chain, and he knew his perfection had been broken. One mistake, one open page, had undone years of careful order. And now the ritual itself was unraveling, for what had once been balance was now miscalculation. When the ledger spread through Dunmore, its pages carried a weight heavier than stone. Families who had whispered of fate now saw their losses written in cold ink, stripped of mystery and clothed in intention. Each absence had a mark, each disappearance a note of subtraction. The words were not violent, but that made them worse. They were calm, precise, as if cruelty were no more remarkable than adding and taking away. For the first time, the townsfolk looked at the bookkeeper and did not see the gentle man who had carried their burdens. They saw the mathematician of death, the mind that had shaped their silence into his own shield. But with this scene came terror, and terror demanded not justice, but erasure. They did not try him. They did not gather in the square to accuse, did not raise their voices in outrage. That would have meant speaking aloud the truth, and truth would have demanded memory. Dunmore had already learned to survive by silence, and now silence was the only answer it knew. So they decided not to expose him, but to bury him, as they had buried the ones he had taken. It was not mercy. It was shame. To reveal what he had done would mean admitting they had lived for years under his hand without seeing, that their trust had been blindness, that their innocence had been complicity. And so they chose the easier path. They would erase him as he had erased others, but without blood, without noise, without even his name on their tongues. The chamber beneath the chapel was the first to go. Men carried stones at night, lowering them down the narrow stair until the floor was buried. The walls were bricked over, the door sealed, the air shut tight inside forever. No prayers were said for those buried in the soil, no markers placed to honor the missing. The town told itself that closing the chamber was enough, that silence over stone would cleanse what lay below. But silence does not purify. It preserves. The garden of erasures remained there in the dark, sealed like a wound under skin, its roots still reaching upward into the life of the town above. The ledger was next. It had been passed from hand to hand, each reader trembling as they turned its pages, and then it was carried into the chapel and locked away. Some said it was burned, but the truth was less final. It was hidden, buried in the ground near the altar, covered in earth as though it were just another coffin in the soil. No one dared destroy it, for to destroy it would mean to accept its reality. Instead, they concealed it, convincing themselves that by hiding the book they had hidden the truth. The child who had uncovered it watched this with eyes wide and hollow. She knew what they were doing. They were choosing the same silence that had allowed the bookkeeper to thrive. They were becoming the very equation he had written. As for the bookkeeper himself, his fate was not public. One morning he was gone. No trial, no punishment, no grave. Some whispered he had been cast into the river, stones tied to his body to drag him beneath. Others said he had been locked away in a cellar to rot until no sound came from him again. The truth was never told, and perhaps never known, for those who carried it out kept their lips sealed until death. All that mattered to the town was that he vanished, as neatly as the ones he had taken before. The difference was only this: now his subtraction was of their own making. But even this act was not courage. It was imitation. They erased him not to stop him, but to stop themselves from remembering. Afterward, Dunmore lived as if nothing had happened. The chapel bell still rang, the market still opened, children still played in the square. But beneath the surface, the sickness remained. Families no longer spoke of the missing, not because they believed in fate, but because they feared the shame of truth. The silence was heavier now, layered with secrets they had chosen to bury alive. The town became its own accomplice, holding the weight of erasure as tightly as the bookkeeper had held his ledger. They told themselves they were safe, but safety built on forgetting is no safety at all. It is surrender. Evil did not end in Dunmore. It was submerged. The chamber sealed, the ledger buried, the man erased, none of it cleansed what had been done. It only locked it deeper, making the silence thicker, the forgetting stronger. The bookkeeper had always believed subtraction was purity, and in the end, the town proved him right. They subtracted him. They subtracted memory. They subtracted truth. And in doing so, they completed the equation he had begun. The Garden of Erasures was no longer his alone. It belonged to all of Dunmore. The child who had seen too much carried the knowledge in her heart, but even she learned that to speak it aloud was to be met with cold eyes and quick shushing. The silence had consumed the town, and now it consumed her too. For now, Dunmore survived by drowning its own secrets. But secrets do not drown forever. They sink, they wait, and in time, they rise again. Years passed, then decades, and Dunmore remade itself on silence. A new generation grew that did not know the names of the missing, because those names were never spoken. The children played in the same square, the chapel bell still tolled, and the town convinced itself that peace had returned. But peace built on forgetting is never peace at all, it is only sleep. Beneath the sleep, the wound still festered. Beneath the chapel, beneath the earth, the chamber remained sealed, and in the soil the ledger remained buried. Time covered it with dust and roots, but time does not erase. It only waits. And when waiting ends, what was hidden returns. The child who had counted differently grew into a woman, though she did not grow whole. She carried the secret of Dunmore inside her like a weight that never shifted. Her voice was quiet, her eyes always lowered, her body bent long before age made it so. She was not loved, not sought after, not remembered kindly. She had seen too much as a child, and the town punished her with neglect, treating her as an echo of something they wanted to forget. She lived on the edge of Dunmore, alone in a small wooden house, her days measured not by bells or gatherings but by her own whispered counts. She recited the names the town had buried, keeping them alive in secret even as the rest of the world acted as though they had never existed. She was the last vessel of memory, and memory was a lonely burden. When she was old and her hands shook with age, a storm came to Dunmore. Rain fell for days, tearing through the soil, collapsing walls, exposing what had been hidden for too long. Near the chapel, the earth gave way, and in the muck a bundle surfaced. It was bound in cracked leather, its pages swollen but intact. The ledger had risen from its grave. Children were the first to find it, playing in the mud when the storm broke. They laughed as they pulled it free, thinking it some strange old book, until an elder snatched it from their hands. The sight of it, the feel of it, carried an unease so deep that even those who did not know its history felt their stomachs twist. It should have been nothing but paper, yet it breathed with the weight of all it carried. The woman came forward then, her frail body trembling but her eyes steady. She told them it was not just a book. She told them it was the truth they had buried with him, the truth they had sealed in silence to save themselves from shame. At first, they laughed at her, dismissing her as a bitter old woman clinging to shadows. But when the pages were opened and the names were read, the laughter died. Generations removed from the missing still recognized the names of their blood. The marks were clear, the equations unbroken, the cruelty undeniable. The ledger spoke of absences no one had explained, of debts balanced not in coins but in lives. And suddenly, the silence of Dunmore was torn open, as raw as it had been in the days when the bookkeeper walked its streets. The town trembled, for the return of the ledger meant the return of memory, and memory is never gentle when it has been buried alive. Families who had forgotten their own grief now felt it anew, sharper than before, because now they knew it had been designed, not destined. The sickness of silence cracked apart, and in its place came shame, anger, and fear. They looked at the old woman differently now, realizing she had carried the truth alone while they had chosen to be blind. But it was too late to undo what they had done to her. She was broken, forgotten, a vessel emptied by years of neglect. She gave them the truth, but she did not forgive them for refusing it when she was young. What returned with the ledger was not only memory but darkness. For the bookkeeper's cruelty had not been destroyed, only delayed. The rituals he created, the chamber he shaped, the philosophy of subtraction, it all lived within those pages. And as the town read them, they realized the danger was not only in what had been done but in how easily it could be done again. The logic was there, cold and convincing, simple enough to seduce anyone who longed for control. It was not madness. It was method. And method can survive centuries if given voice. The ledger was not only a record. It was a seed, and by unearthing it, Dunmore had allowed it to breathe again. The woman died not long after, her body giving out once her burden was no longer hers alone. Some said she died relieved, others said she died in despair. Perhaps both were true. But with her death, the ledger remained, and with it the question that no one dared speak aloud: what if the subtraction began again? The chamber was still beneath the chapel, sealed but not gone. The soil still carried the memory of blood, the town still carried the weakness of silence, and now the ledger had returned to remind them all. Dunmore had not escaped its past. It had only delayed it. And now the delay was over. Evil does not always announce itself with screams. Often it grows in silence, nurtured not by chaos but by order so complete it feels safe. In Dunmore, the bookkeeper had shown how cruelty could wear the face of innocence, how subtraction could be disguised as kindness, how an entire town could be reshaped not by violence in the streets but by quiet rituals that erased life without leaving trace. His work did not end when he was gone, for evil of that kind does not die with the man who carries it. It seeps into the soil, into memory, into the way a people choose to live afterward. The townsfolk believed they had sealed the chamber, buried the ledger, drowned their shame. But silence is not a grave. It is a seed. And when the ledger surfaced again, so too did the truth they had worked so hard to hide. The return of memory forced Dunmore to change. For the first time, the town spoke openly of the missing, of the years when absences were explained away as fate, of the shame of having trusted a mask of kindness that concealed ritual cruelty. Families that had long avoided each other gathered to share names aloud, to piece together the sum of what had been erased. For the first time, they counted together. A memorial was raised on the square, not with statues or grandeur, but with a plain wall of names. It was the wall that broke the silence. People pressed their hands against it, whispering the names they had once forbidden themselves to speak. The wall did not heal them. It did not erase what had been buried. But it forced Dunmore to remember, and remembrance is the first weapon against forgetting. Confessions followed. Old men and women admitted what they had seen but chosen to ignore. Some spoke of the bookkeeper's strange habits, others of the unease they had pushed aside when he smiled too gently, when his kindness seemed too rehearsed. They confessed that they had known, in some small way, but had silenced themselves for fear of what speaking might bring. These confessions were not trials. No justice could be served for crimes decades old, for victims already erased. But they stripped away the illusion that the town had been helpless. They admitted the truth that evil had thrived not because it was hidden, but because it was easier to ignore. And in that admission lay the heaviest weight of all. The town's laws changed. Records were kept with more scrutiny, the chapel opened its doors to oversight, and no one was allowed to serve in quiet offices without watchful eyes upon them. But even as these protections were built, the people knew they could not legislate away what had already been proven, that evil does not need weapons when it has silence, that cruelty does not need rage when it has routine. The bookkeeper's legacy was not only in the lives he erased but in the caution that followed him. His rituals had shown that the greatest danger is not the scream of violence but the quiet that allows it to go unchallenged. The weight of Dunmore's history pressed down through generations. Parents told their children not only of the ledger but of the silence that made it possible. The story became less about a man and more about a warning. They spoke of the kindness that hides calculation, the charity that disguises rehearsal, the order that conceals erasure. They told their children that evil does not always come with teeth and blood, but sometimes with gentle eyes and steady hands. They told them to count differently, to question what others accept, to speak when others fall quiet. It was a lesson written not in law but in sorrow. And yet the final reflection could not be avoided. Evil had not been destroyed in Dunmore. It had been exposed, submerged, then unearthed again. The bookkeeper was gone, but his method had been preserved in pages that still existed, in a chamber that still waited beneath stone, in memories that still carried the rhythm of his cruelty. The question lingered over the memorial wall, whispered in the chapel, pressed into the minds of those who dared to look back. What if it happens again? What if another mask appears, another figure of order, another gentle face hiding calculation? Would silence rise once more? Would the town, or any town, recognize the sickness before it spread? Or would the pattern repeat, neat as numbers in a ledger, clean as subtraction on a page? The weight of unspoken evil is heavier than any stone wall or buried chamber. It lingers not in the dead, but in the living who choose to close their eyes. Dunmore learned this truth, but truth is fragile when memory grows faint. The story of the bookkeeper is not just the story of a town long ago. It is a warning, quiet and sharp, pressing against the silence of every place that believes itself safe. For evil thrives best not in violence, but in the quiet that surrounds it. And so the voice closes with the only question that matters: what do you think? Could it happen again, hidden, orderly, innocent to the eye?